Alright guys, so web development involves many different technologies, including HTML, CSS, programming languages, frameworks, tools, and much more. But HTML and CSS are what I call the building blocks. This is where you're going to start, whether you want to build just simple 5-page websites or large social networks and online stores. So I want to talk about the different roles of HTML and CSS, how they play into web development. So HTML is actually short for Hypertext Markup Language, and that's exactly what it is. It's a markup language. Many people that are brand new to web development think it's actually a programming language, but it's not. A programming language is where you write code that can do things based on logic. So you can check to see if something is true or false, and then do some type of action based on that condition. You can also do things like math. You can create reusable functions, and the list goes on. You can't do any of that with HTML. HTML is purely visual, and it's used to create and construct documents that are viewable inside of a web browser. It doesn't have any kind of behavior associated with it other than displaying content. And when I say content, I mean text, links, images, things like that. Now, this isn't to minimize HTML. In fact, there is no internet as far as the web browser goes without HTML. It's extremely important and relevant, and it always will be. Every single site that you visit displays its markup using HTML, and sometimes it's handwritten, sometimes it's actually generated by another programming language, but when you view the compiled source of a website, you're always going to see HTML markup. Okay, now HTML by itself is used to display content, but it has little to no styling. So HTML on its own is very, very ugly. And this is where CSS comes in. So CSS stands for Cascading Style Sheets, and it's what's called a styling language or a style sheet language. Like HTML, it's not an actual programming language. It's purely visual, only instead of being used to display content, it's used to style the content and style the layout. Now, CSS is getting more powerful itself. You can now have things like variables. You can do some calculations and so on. It can also be extended with something called Sass or Less, which are CSS precompilers. We'll talk a little bit more about Sass later and talk about some of the things you can do with it, but we're gonna do that much later. So basically these two go hand in hand. HTML handles the content display, CSS handles styling it with colors, alignment, fonts, and everything else to do with the styling. Now, as I said, web development includes a huge range of technologies to the point where sometimes it's very overwhelming. But these two are the building blocks because no matter how complicated the web application, it still uses HTML and CSS to display the visual appearance. Let's take a web app like Facebook or Amazon. These are huge web applications that do things like have user accounts. You can sign up, register. You can create posts on Facebook. Amazon does credit card processing. She has a shopping cart. You can't have that functionality with just HTML and CSS. You need some kind of back-end programming language, and there's a lot to choose from. And you also need a database for storage of user accounts and posts and stuff like that. Now, this is stuff you're going to learn in another course, but without HTML and CSS, Facebook and Amazon cease to exist because HTML and CSS are responsible for displaying the content to you in a browser, whether it's on a computer, mobile device, or tablet, whatever it may be. So these two technologies are always the first ones that you're going to learn before moving to more advanced web programming to build shopping carts and stuff like that. So you can kind of think of HTML and CSS as the human body, and think of programming with other languages as the human brain. They both need each other. Now, JavaScript is sort of in its own league because it is a programming language, but it can run on both the front end, which is within the browser, as well as on the back end server. Okay, so JavaScript can be used in the front end for things like form validation, click events, stuff like that. So JavaScript is probably the next thing you want to learn after HTML and CSS. All right, so we've established basically the purpose of HTML and CSS. It's to display web pages and style web pages. So what can we do with just HTML and CSS, not knowing any other programming language? So after this course, you'll be able to build any kind of static website. And by static, I mean still, so something where you're not creating user accounts, you're not creating posts, things like that. And a good example of a static website is, let's say, a portfolio to display some of your projects, a small business website, maybe a plumber wants a website where they can display their company info, their contact info, stuff like that. Plumber, construction, flower shop, anything like that. Also informational and brochure websites. Okay, you can build some really beautiful stuff with just HTML and CSS. You just can't have that special kind of functionality like a shopping cart or something like that. You're going to need to learn more to do that stuff. You can also build the visual part of anything. So even an online store or a huge social network like Facebook, you could build basically the shell of it. You'll just have to have a programmer add the life to it where you can actually click post and have it post, or upload an image or something like that. Okay, so you can do this stuff with just HTML and CSS, and I'm going to show you all of this throughout the course. All right, so that's it, guys. In the next video, we're going to start to set up our environment. We're going to need something called a text editor so that we can actually write our HTML and CSS. We're going to use something called VSCode, and we're going to install some extensions to allow it to do some extra things for us. And of course, you need a web browser. We're going to talk about all this in the next video.
Living life, every day, late at night, not okay. All I want, and I pray, all I need are some better days. Fuck me, I'm looking in the mirror, so foggy, but I've never seen clearer.